that's one of our strategies as well. So basically that is what we will discuss. And
I just want to say one thing. This is a follow-up. I've had several, I think I said earlier in the morning that we've getting a lot of attention. And one of the things that the paper that you mentioned that you would be writing about best practices, you might also want to look at it, also recommendations, things that you would think the institutions themselves may want to look at. Your research, which you've been delving into, areas where there can be change. I know that the president of Salisbury remarked upon that, and later I sent out, they were all curious about this panel discussion, and I sent to President Hrabowski and to President White the topics that you had questioned, some of the questions that you would be looking at, and they were very grateful, and they were looking forward to this report. So I would strongly, consider putting some recommendations or things that you uncover as you go into all your research in that report. And Anna, I can see Blair's here. Everybody, I'm going to let you introduce everybody and welcome. I don't know if I want to call you professors or should be very formal, but I want to welcome all all of our panel discussion members. Blair Hayes is from UMGC and we know each other, so I'm going to wave at him. And Ms. Dodge, I don't know, you're from College Park, is that correct?
Yes.
No? Okay. And then where's Dr. Cox? Where's she? There she is. All right, wave. Thank you for coming, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to let Anna do the introductions and step back and listen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. So I just kind of first want to start by thanking our panelists for being here. It's a great honor for us and a great pleasure to have you and share your perspectives on structural racism. So I'm just going to briefly introduce you. Just Elizabeth already introduced you, but just to make sure that everybody gets to know you a little bit. So first we have Dr. Georgina Dosh, the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion from University of Maryland and College Park. And if you can say something so that the screen shows you, like if you can say hello, then we can see you in the screen, Dr. Georgina.
Sure, thanks, Anna, I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you today.
Thank you. And then we also have Dr. Blair Hayes, Vice President, Chief Diversity Officer, and Ombudsman from University of Maryland Global Campus. And again, Dr. Hayes, if you could say something so that we can see you.
Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here today and happy to be here with Georgina and Leah, of course.
Thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Leah Cox, Vice President of Inclusion and Institutional Equity at Towson University. And Dr. Cox, if you could please say something so that we can see you.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And so again, thank you very much for being with us in this panel. We are looking forward to learning more about the structural racism. And so we're going to start with that question. Can you tell us what is structural racism? Mm-hmm. Or how would you define structural racism? And then let's start in the order that I first, maybe start with Dr. Georgina Dosh.
Sure. So let me start by saying that in many ways, structural racism doesn't really have a definition. I mean, there are 1,000,001 definitions out there, don't get me wrong, but it is such a complex system and it is such an ingrained part of who we are as a country that it's really hard to simply define it in one way, because the minute you define it in one way, it's like that goo, it sort of squishes out of your hand and appears elsewhere in some interesting fashion. So it's an interconnected network that is difficult to define, because I think the best way to say it is that structural racism is really, it kills opportunity. That's what it does. I think it's best to define it by its impact. It kills opportunity for multitudes of people. What ends up happening is that these barriers get constructed both consciously and unconsciously for specific reasons. And then another barrier gets constructed, and these barriers eventually end up building a wall. And it creates a labyrinth that certain people are forced to navigate, whereas others may not be constrained by those walls, may have freedom of movement. And I want to give you an example here to sort of, explain why this is so hard to pin down with a definition. Let's say that the government agency decides to create and construct some low-income housing, with all good intention. Okay, and I think that this is something that really resonates within this particular moment as we see people being evicted from where they live due to COVID and the economic impact. So this housing is primarily going to be for Black and Latino people. However, even as they're putting up this housing for a good reason, they fail to take into account how this is with the location of it. Is it going to be near where the jobs are? What other infrastructure is going to be there? What type of schools are going to be there? And I mean, we've all seen this happen historically, right? Once the housing is built, the school district, which is already unfunded, doesn't have a strong tax base to pull from. And so those schools are inadequately resourced from the very outset. We see this occurring over and over again. And then what ends up happening is that the local government ends up spending its resources to provide transportation, not to folks who are living within this housing, but to others throughout the region. So again, we see another wall being constructed that is constraining the opportunities that are faced by the people who live within this housing. So this whole community is going to lose opportunities for good education, for quality housing, for living wage jobs, and of course for those support systems. And so again, there are definitions, and I'm going to give space for Blair and Leah to provide some more concrete terminology, but I really want us to sort of grasp the almost nefarious nature of structural racism from the outset.
Yeah, that's a very great start, and give us an example of it. And so maybe Dr. Blair Hayes, could you please elaborate on what is structural racism?
Sure. I was hoping Georgina was going to give us a definition too, because as she said, there is not one definition. And I think it is one of those things, it when you see it. But I think what we really know it to be is it's a continuous thing where one group is advantaged and another group is continually disadvantaged, right? It's not just a one-off thing. It's a continuous thing that happens time after time after time. And it just becomes accepted after a while because you're used to it being that way. And so I think that's the challenge with it. That's why it's so hard to break break those chains that exist, because it is something that you're just so used to seeing it. Because when these policies are put in place or programs are developed, as people, we always think about self first, right? Everyone's pretty self-focused, right? What does this mean for me? What does it mean for people for my group? How are they going to be benefited? And so as those things are developed and put in place, they're not thinking about the ill effects that may happen for other groups, because one, they may not know. It may be an unconscious thing. We're not saying that anyone necessarily starts off by saying, let me put a program in place that is inherently bad for somebody else. Mm-hmm. But you can say, I am developing a program that is inherently good for me, right? And you're just not considering the ill effects that it may have on somebody else. And so, I think one description that I've heard when talking about structural racism, it's about starting off with 2 strikes, right? You are already behind the 8 ball. You are already put in a position where you are not likely to succeed because you are put in the worst position possible. And if you are able to succeed, that means you are going above and beyond, and you have been able to exist in a world that is not created for you to be successful. And so that's something that really is a challenge. And so when you talk about, I know we'll talk later about how do you combat this? How do you fix this? And there are no quick fixes. And but I do think the fact that people are talking about it and are trying to figure out, what does this look like? What does this mean? Especially if you're not in the group that may be impacted by it. It's really important these conversations are happening. So that's how I think about it. Just starting with 2 strikes and starting behind the 8 ball without any, before you've taken your first step.
Mm-hmm. Great, that gives more insights about that definition, like more examples of it. And Dr. Leah Cox, could you elaborate on what is structural racism?
Sure. Let me just start by saying I want to agree and support with all that Georgina and Blair have said. There's one thing I'd like to disagree with is, and Blair knows we've always had these conversations. We don't always recognize it, right? It happens across our system. So we're talking about policies, public and institutional policies, practices, cultural representations, other norms that and values that have been set up in places like Georgina might have said in the public housing. It's in our institutions, K through 12 and higher education. It's in our companies, our organizations that are set up to perpetuate sort of inequities, especially among racial groups. So we oftentimes have these policies and structures in place for a very long time that people don't even recognize that they're there, and that they create this imbalance that continues for a very long time that becomes structural in nature. And so that it becomes almost impossible to succeed for some groups of folk, or more difficult to succeed. I won't say impossible, but difficult. And so, as Blair sort of stated, we're going to talk a little bit more about what we do, how we recognize it, some of the things that are happening at our institution. But these systems have been around for a while to create these inequities consciously and sometimes unconsciously. So I don't want to repeat all that they've said because they made great points in terms of structural racism.
Yeah, no, great.
Can I just jump in, because I really want to emphasize something that Leah just said, which I think is important, is that all too often we tend to hear that structural racism is simply unconscious. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that at times it is very conscious. So for the example that I gave of public housing, why does public housing get put up in a particular area? It's because certain communities, predominantly white communities, oppose having affordable housing in their communities. So these are conscious decisions that are being made, knowing that affordable housing is going to bring in Black and brown people that they do not want to have as their neighbors. So at times it can be very conscious, and I think it's important that we recognize that. So thanks, Leah.
No, great. Thank you.
And let me add one more thing to that too, because I think when we're talking about and trying to define structural, I think to me, what I think about it is it becomes structural because it's once you pile one thing on top of another, it becomes hardened and it becomes set in stone, becomes set in place, right? And then it is part of the structure, it's part of the fabric of what the foundation that things are built on. And that's why it's hard to move, because it is so set in stone after so many years of being piled on. So I think just the imagery of the structure itself is what we're trying to talk about. How do we fix that? How do you break that down?
Yes, and I think like this your three perspectives give us a very good starting point to understand. So we have a problem with some setup that makes it difficult for people, whether conscious or unconscious, but it makes it difficult for people to succeed. And so thinking about that, so can you elaborate on how is this present in higher education? How is it present in your campus? And let's start with Dr. Cox in this case. So how is it present in your campus?
Yes. So as we know, it's present on probably pretty much all of our campuses, especially if we're a predominantly white institution. And it's present either through who we promote in terms of our faculty to tenure, associate, assistant, full professors, how they get there, who's hired, who's recruited, who's mentored. We have it with our students. How do our students get there? What's the admission policy look like? How are they selected? Who sits on these selection committees to determine that? We also look at our administration, our faculty and staff, and how does that look? Who's sitting in those C-suites? Who's making the decisions around our policies and our procedures? Who's making decisions about our funding? What programs are funded? Who's moving forward? Who's not? So it still exists, especially in higher education. It's very visible. We know that all of our institutions are struggling to make some of these systemic changes, structural changes. But it's, as Blair sort of suggested, it's a long haul. It's going to take some time to uncover all the policies and procedures that sort of create these inequities for all of our underrepresented minorities on our campuses. It's going to take a while. So,
yeah, great, thank you. And then so when we can continue with Dr. Georgina Dosh now.
Sure.
How
I
is it
think
present in your campus?
It's present in our campus in the same ways that it's present throughout all of society. I mean, because it's so critical to I'm reading Jay's I'm reading Jay's comment in the chat and sort of chuckling to myself because none of us want to give a specific example to make our campuses look bad. Come on, give us a break. But of course, we can give you multiple examples of the ways in which higher education operates. But the one thing that I do want to emphasize is the way, again, all of these walls that get erected are interconnected. So, for example, we talk about the challenges that we have in admitting qualified students to our institutions without taking into consideration what's been happening in K-12, where we have Black students specifically who are being pulled out for disciplinary reasons at unprecedented rates, that far outnumber their presence because of the ways in which they are viewed and looked at. And I think it's really important to understand that race is the unspoken motivator behind this series of acts that leads to these decisions of where to place the walls within this framework of structural racism. I think that is another one of those little facts that we need to acknowledge up front as to where all of this began. And we don't have conversations on our campus about that. And, we'll talk more about that as we talk about ways in which to begin to address this. But we need to understand that our students, particularly, our BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, people of color, those students are coming into a system that was intentionally created without them in mind. In fact, it was intentionally created to exclude them, and this is something that I tell students consistently, is that universities were made for the sons and not the daughters, the sons of the wealthy landowners. It was not made for other people. And so there's this historical adjustment that needs to take place, even as universities cling to tradition. And so we can already see this tension in which these walls were historically erected long ago, and this sort of urge to keep those walls in place by not changing systems, much in the way that Leah spoke of. What counts toward tenure and why? We need to start having those discussions. Who gets promoted and why? What are the sort of strictures that we use? And I think that is something that we could really control and would be a really healthy place for us to begin having discussions about how structural racism has an impact on all aspects of our institutions. So I'll pause and let Blair jump in.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And, I think when we talk about specific examples, obviously that is challenging, but I think when you think about what has happened in our country over the past year in college campuses across the country. So if you think about some college campuses that have buildings that were named after slaveholders, have statues on their campuses by slaveholders or people who, okay with slavery, however you describe it. And you have Black students who every day have to walk by those statues, or they have to live in those dorms, or they have to go into those buildings. And, there are some who will say, well, it's just a building, it doesn't mean anything. But if you think about the psychological impact that can have on people every day, to say, this is a place where I'm supposed to be welcomed, I'm supposed to be developing and being put in a situation where I can be just as successful as my white counterparts, but at the same time, I have to walk by these statues of people who hate me or my ancestors, right? And so that is a structural thing that is in place where, it has to be broken down. You can't just ignore it. You can't just walk by it and say that it's okay, because it does have impact on people, whether they know it or not, because that is also the psychological burden that also comes with being a part of an underrepresented population as mentioned before, in a world that was not meant for you, right? In an environment that wasn't meant for you. And so until we can level set and make sure that there is equal footing for everyone to, and not just be successful, but to succeed or fail on their own, right? That's the thing, because a lot of times what we're talking about is that they're already put in a position to fail. So we're not saying we need things to be imbalanced, and so that Black people or people of color will just be successful all the time, but we want them to be able to succeed or fail on their own merit. And that's what we really need to be creating on our campuses.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in there because Jane, I think I can give you a specific example that I think is probably happening on all of our campuses, and that is the impact that COVID is having on specific populations. And again, this goes back to that interwoven relationships that I'm talking about, because we're seeing the undue impact of the pandemic on Black and Brown people. And yet we have those students on our campus and they're being held to the same standards that all students are held to. And we're not questioning those standards. Don't get me wrong. I think, all of you as faculty are, please, be a little more gentle on your students, as we deal with the impact of this pandemic. And I know that a lot of faculty are stepping into that very willingly, but there are some who are not. And then there are all of us, and I think, I'm going to include myself in this as well, who look at people who may be struggling, and it's difficult not to compare. It's like, okay, you may not be doing well, but this student here who may even be of the same race or have a similar profile seems to be getting by. Why can't you? And so I think that as long as we sort of use this sort of blanket comparison methodology to rank our students and to rank work in general, it really causes us to have some problems.
Yes.
And
And
jump in and
yes, yes,
uh,
please.
kind of finish out Blair's analogy in terms of our residence halls and buildings on our campuses, and understanding there is a process, policy, and procedures at the regents level. Who sits as a regent in terms of how we name and what we can do in naming our buildings at our state institutions? And so that structure was put in place a long time ago. And those buildings, were passed and determined, yes, you can name that, with not giving real thought to how's it affecting racial minority across our campuses. And so even now, as we try to change some of those buildings, sometimes we get pushback if they're older buildings on our campus and then have to be passed by the regents to say we can do that.
Yeah, that's very good points. So there is definitely many aspects of it. Before we continue, can I ask Bill to mute yourself, please, because we get some interference, and I just noticed that you are unmuted. So okay, okay. So so I just kind of want to read also, so the next question that I will ask is, what are some key initiatives in your campus designed to eliminate or reduce structural racism? But before we go into that question, I also want to read some of the questions that are on the chat, because they are related to this. Now, for example, how do we balance having Black and Hispanic faculty serve on committees, yet not overburden them to the point that it takes away from the research? And then another comment here is that the average GPA from freshmen at College Park is 4.11, and the SAT score is about 1400. In order to achieve those type of scores, one needs to be highly advantaged, in particular financially. And the money it takes to take tests repeatedly, purchase study assistance, and all that is enormous. So those are some related to the things that you were mentioning, that some students are disadvantaged, maybe part of the solution that you may want to comment, or you can comment on other aspects. So in this case, maybe let's start with Dr. Blair Hayes. What is it? I'll repeat the question. What are some few key initiatives on your campus designed to eliminate or reduce structural racism?
Sure. So I think a few years ago, we started going from a textbook model to what we call our OERs, or open education resources. And so we no longer have textbooks at all, because we were finding that some of our students, that was a factor in how they were doing class, because they couldn't afford the books, right? So maybe they were getting a book and sharing it among each other, or they'd have to go to a library to get a book, or they would just try to participate in classes without books, right? And we all know that that is not an avenue for success, right? And so what we found is, if we eliminated textbooks, right, we're level setting we're evening the playing field, because then everyone has access to the free resources that we make available online. And so obviously there are challenges to that. Some people learn better by having the text in their hands and are used to that model. But, we found that it was a way to remove some of the financial element to the disparity that we were seeing amongst our students. So that's one thing that we've done, and that was a few years ago. Another thing that we do, just because obviously the nature of who we are at UMGC is we're virtual, right? And we're online. And so we don't have the same sort of cost built into our enrollment around, residence life and dorms and those sort of things. And so we were able to really get our numbers, our costs for enrollment down fairly low. And so I think that is also a way that we've tried to make sure that we can reach out to the broadest population possible, because we don't want the cost to be the differentiator between who is able to get a college education and who's not able to get a college education. And so those are two things that we've done that allow us to continue to get, we have a very diverse student body, and it's always reflected for any of you all who have ever been to a UMGC graduation. You know, we are graduating really, we have very diverse graduates every year, but it's because we're trying to remove those things that are cost prohibitive and just make people look at it and say, this is not realistic for me because I can't afford it. That should never be what, you know, is the differentiator between who's able to get a college degree and who's not.
Yes, thank you. And then maybe let's go to Dr. Leah Cox. So what are some few key initiatives?
Yes. So we recognize that there's a great disparity in the representation on our faculty, and especially our tenured faculty. So we have now begun the process of what we call inclusive advocates, who we've done 40 hours of training with. That will sit on search committees across the campus from every college. So anytime there's a search, there's an inclusive advocate who will sit in that search to be sort of the eyes and ears and support for the faculty in that search process from beginning to end. Each of the colleges and departments will determine if that inclusive advocate has a vote in the search committee, which is fine. But they then are there to sort of help steer that conversation to point out some of the inequities that might pop up. So let me just share. So one of the things we saw is that in one of our colleges that folks were only considered for an interview once the faculty member had gone to a conference where they may appear, right? Which again disadvantages a lot of graduates whose schools or departments may not be able to afford to send them to the once a year professional development conference in California, right? They just don't have the money to send their graduates. The graduate may not have money. And so they're gonna miss out on some key interviews for schools that are having open position, tenure track positions. And so in order to level the playing field, we're getting rid of that. You know, yes, you can find some folk at the conference, but everybody should have the opportunity to apply and interview. And then with that, the inclusive advocate will be there to catch that if that's happening, make some suggestions on how we change some of those things that have always been done, but never been caught. If there are conversations that come up during the search process, whether it's about someone's CV or their research, you know, what are we looking at? How are we evaluating them? Who's not at the table in terms of the pool that we're recruiting? So they're going to be key to us making some pivotal changes at Towson, hopefully.
Those are great initiatives. And Dr. Dosh, can you share some initiatives from College Park?
Sure. First, I did want to sort of reinforce what Leah said, because I think it's really wonderful. I was at a previous institution where we had diversity advocates that we used in a similar fashion, and it was highly effective. And I also just want to state that I think that really all of our efforts need to start with the faculty. I think that is critical. So I just want to put that out there before I then talk about something that we're doing with students, because in some ways students are the easiest population to deal with because they're very aware of how they want the world to appear and how they want higher education institutions to appear, and know that it's not living up to their image. One of the things that we've done that's been really fascinating is we pulled together a group of Black student leaders on campus and said, look, we want to have conversations with you. So some of us on the administration meet with them regularly, and we asked them to pull together a list of demands. You know, there have been lists of demands made over the years, but we're like, what do you think needs to happen on campus? Let's not posit these as demands, but what concerns you? What bothers you? Let's talk about these things openly. And so we asked them to pull together a list of 25 concerns, which they pulled together and submitted to us. They went out and they polled their fellow students and pulled all of this together. And now we're going to work through that list. And we're going to have honest, open dialogue. And this is something that can be difficult sometimes with those of us who are beyond a certain age. Again, with students, it's a little bit easier. But we're going to have honest dialogue of, okay, here's the pieces of this we can do. Here are the legal reasons maybe we can't do this piece of it, but we want them to understand, because we also want to arm them to be effective activists and advocates for what it is that they wish to see happen. If something if we can't do something because there's some type of law that prevents us from doing it, well, then that's their responsibility as the next generation to start questioning that law, to see what needs to happen within the legal framework and arenas to get that changed so that it more accurately reflects what their needs might be. So that's something that we're doing that is both challenging and fun, because as you know, when you're dealing with large student groups, you cannot make everyone happy. And we realize that we are not going to do so. You have students on all ends of the spectrum in terms of what it is they want to see happen. But we think that by having these open conversations, at least we can put these things out into the air, because all too often when we're dealing particularly with racial disparities and structural racism, we don't want to talk about it. We try to, sort of color code everything in ways that the main issue of race doesn't surface. And that's where we're wanting to pull up to the surface.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Alex. So all those are great initiatives in your campuses, and it's nice to hear that there are many, many initiatives happening. And now, to continue with our questions, this is something we observe, like in some instances, and for example, the term microaggressions comes often. Racism is more subtle and unintentional rather than overt. However, it still creates feelings of exclusion and stress and limits access. What can faculty do to educate ourselves and increase our awareness of subtle forms of racism? And in this case, maybe let's start again with Dr. Dosh. What are some, something we can do to educate ourselves about microaggressions? Maybe start by maybe defining what are microaggressions, or whichever way you want to go.
Right. I'm going to refer everyone to some of the seminal work that was done on microaggressions by Daryl Sue, which I think is really critical to sort of understanding microaggressions and understanding their impact. And I like the analogy that he uses the analogy of microaggressions having an impact like drops of water. But I heard a better one from another scholar that I really like, which is like getting a paper cut. So having a microaggression committed against you is like getting a paper cut. And a microaggression, I'll just use some very obvious ones, like someone telling you like, oh, wow, you did really good on that math test for a girl. So there's the expectation that somehow, a female is not going to perform well on a math test, and when you think about it as a paper cut, you get one little paper cut, and it doesn't matter. But then you get another paper cut. Let's say that somebody says, you do not present, as white or as American, and somebody compliments you on, oh, you speak English really well, when in fact you've been speaking it your whole freaking life, But all of these paper cuts. Now think about getting 100 of these over a day. By then, you're pretty bloody. One paper cut, you stick your thumb in your mouth and you get over it, right? But if you're covered with these over the course of a day, you're very wounded. And, there's a lot of research that indicates that microaggressions and the accumulation of microaggressions actually have a larger and more negative impact than overt racism. And I think that's really significant. And I think that really forces us all to kind of step back and say, okay, what might I be doing to commit microaggressions? And if you're a person of color, that doesn't mean that you can't commit microaggressions. We all can, against various populations, because we don't always know all of the cultural norms of every population and every culture that we might interact with. And so one of the things that I always tell faculty to be prepared to do is to apologize. And that means learning how to apologize. You are going to step in it at some point in time. And what tends to happen is we get fearful, and so we withdraw, and we're like, okay, I'm not going to say anything because I'm going to upset somebody at some point in time. Yes, you are. Okay, just own that. And how do you apologize? How do you apologize in a way that does not commit yet another microaggression by placing the blame on the person that you're apologizing to, because we tend to do that. How do you apologize without letting yourself off the hook, without providing all of those little justifications? Oh, well, what I meant was, how do you give a sincere apology by centering the person who has been impacted in that apology and allowing the apology to be about them rather than about you? So that's a skill set that it actually takes some practice and time to develop. And I would encourage everyone to consider developing it.
Great, thank you. And then let's go to Dr. Blair Hayes. How can faculty educate themselves to increase our awareness on these subtle forms of racism?
Yeah, well, I think just to continue the point that Georgina was making is that, it's important that if someone is impacted that way, that you allow them to express how they feel. And it's not an opportunity for you to then say, no, you shouldn't feel that way because this is what I meant, right? It's not a time for you to be defensive. It's a time for you to understand and empathize with someone's feeling and say, okay, that's how you feel. I did not mean to make you feel that way. So, but it's not that their feelings are wrong, right? And so that is where the conversation just gets complicated if you are having two different conversations at that point, because one person is saying, you made me feel this way, and the other person is trying to defend themselves from, but it's not an attack. They're not under attack at that point, so there's no need to be defensive. It's just about, this is how I feel. Can you understand how that might have made me feel? And, so I think both people play a part in that conversation. And it is a skill set. It's something that needs to be practiced, and it's something that, people need to, after they've had these conversations, to reflect on the conversation and see how it went, what could have gone better, because there's always room to improve in any sort of interpersonal conversation. And so I think too often what we do is we get into these highly pressurized situations where one person's offensive, one person's hurt, and no one is heard. And so then you just walk away and nothing's been resolved. And so then you come back together and that tension can still exist. And so you need to, if you don't resolve it in time, it's just going to keep building upon itself. And so, what we talk about a lot of times is when someone has made you feel that way, don't attack back, but say, and especially if you're a friend, right? So we always talk about what can you do to help a friend in this situation? So if I see my friend who has said something inappropriate to another colleague, I can take him to the side and say, let me not say it. I don't think you meant it that way, but the way that came across was X, Y, Z. And so you are taking that person to the side. You're not putting them in a position where they have to be defensive, but you are educating them about how next time in a certain situation they could present themselves differently. And so it's an opportunity for all of us to call things out when we see it, but call it out in a way that it doesn't attack, doesn't put someone defensive, but allows it to be a dialogue and a conversation, and a conversation that is really built on making them a better person and making them better for having the conversation. And so I think that's what we always try to talk to our staff, faculty, students in those situations that will inevitably occur at some point.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. And just kind of maybe like before we go to Dr. Cox, just kind of want to read some of the comments in here that, there's a classic, I apologize to anyone who has offended rather than apologizing for causing the offense. And then, academics, especially in STEM, tend to think, but your feelings aren't logical, and that's mentally both negates the other person's experience and defends the speaker from fault. So it's very related to what you were mentioning. And now maybe we can go to Dr. Leah Cox, and so what are some things we can do to educate ourselves?
Yeah, so I think Blair and Georgina are very correct on sort of pointing out dialogue is important. It absolutely is. It's a skill set that has to be developed. So I would suggest, if you haven't received any kind of training around how to have these intergroup or one-on-one conversations and dialogues, that we do that. The other part is when your colleagues tell you that this is how they felt, you have to accept it, right? Just accept it. Don't negate it. Don't debate it, right? This isn't a debate. It's about someone sharing their feelings. The other part is about not having your colleagues, especially those who are underrepresented minorities, do all the training and teaching for you. So this is a time for all of us to level up, right? That means that you may have to do some readings. You may have to engage in professional organizations that are having webinars or seminars around these issues. There are certainly narratives across all of our campuses that are happening. There are book readings, book clubs, all kinds of things that are going on that you can engage in without saying to your fellow colleague who may be someone who's Black or brown, so tell me what I need to know, or how does this affect? I mean, sometimes you have to get to a point where you're taking control of the learning yourself, and then engage in those conversations, right? Because you don't want to leave, as someone said in our chat, you know, how do we keep from all of our Black and brown people having to do extra work? Now's the time for all of us to do work, right? Around these issues, around anti-racism, around microaggressions. There's lots of materials, webinars. You can go on YouTube and learn some things. So it's out there. You just have to avail yourself of wanting to learn and be in that space.
Yes, and those are all great points. And yes, I agree. Like this is kind of coming related to not overburdening minority faculty. And just before we move to the next topic, I just kind of want to read another couple of other comments. It says one I missed before. Indeed, we moved. Oh no, I missed it. No, well, my screen moved, but I just kind of wanted to emphasize one person who wrote there that we also need to be able to accept apologies, and also that's an important thing. So when somebody apologizes, to be grateful and accept the apology. And then finally, one couple of people wrote that there is much negativity surrounding being wrong. But you know, sometimes teaching people that being wrong is learning, a learning experience will help, and active listening skills are critical for everyone. So like, you know, so just wanted to read those comments like before we move on to the next topic, but those are all are great insights. And another topic related to structural racism is that is wondering about the diversity in the campuses. So is the diversity in your campus appropriately represented in the higher administration positions, for example, president, vice president, deans, etc.? What are some reasons for which it is important to represent the demography of the campus in higher administration positions, and how can this be achieved? And in this case, let's start with Dr. Cox, and then.
Okay, so I would say in the last 5 years, Towson has begun to move the needle, and I think that this started with the selection of our president, Kim Schatzel. Before she got there, the cabinet did not have anyone of color on the cabinet, which spoke volumes to her, and she went about making those changes, creating my position on the campus. And so the cabinet is more diverse than it's ever been. Still, we can do better. And we know that some of our administrative positions, from VP down to AVP and director, we have some work to do. We know that our faculty do not look like the percentages of students that we have on our campus, and we need to do better. You know, unfortunately, the percentage of our faculty is nowhere close to the almost 50% of students of color on our campus. And so we recognize that there's a lot of work to be done, and it can happen. It just is going to take a little bit of time to move the needle.
Yes, thank you. And then maybe let's talk to Dr. Dosh.
I want to agree with and align myself with everything that Leah just said. This is a very similar situation in College Park. When I arrived, you know, my position was elevated. This was not a vice presidency. I'm actually the inaugural vice president in this position for diversity and inclusion on campus. And when I arrived, the president's cabinet included myself, our athletic director, who identifies as Black, and then President Lowe, who identifies as Asian American. And that was it, you know, and it's a fairly large cabinet. So things are pretty much the same. We currently have an African-American president, which is quite lovely. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot of changes that need to happen as well. And those changes need to happen because of cultural representation, because, you know, at the heart of the microaggressions, at the heart of the structural racism, at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about are people's biases. And these biases are formed by the cultural representations that they see. I think that there's so much interesting research and exercises that have been done. One that fascinated me is when a group of fifth graders were asked to draw a picture of a scientist. And they all drew a white man in a lab coat. They all did, even the children of color did. These are the representations that we see. And, we can't change that unless we actually start providing some different images for people to actually visualize what a particular position might look like. And I also think it's very critical for our students as well, because when they don't see themselves represented, it's not just a matter of sort of this default, to a specific person within a certain position, but it also becomes a limiting factor to them, where they can't visualize themselves within a particular position, and where they feel that their identity in and of itself is not important on the campus because it's not being represented in places where they feel it matters.
Yes, and those are very important points. And then let's go to Dr. Hayes. So how is the demography of your campus represented, and why is it important?
Yeah, I think my story is similar to my colleagues here, but I will say, just going on the representation point, I think it's important not only for those students of color to see themselves represented in those senior level positions, but it's also important that those other students who aren't of color see the diversity reflected in those positions as well, because they need to know that it's not always going to be someone like them who is in charge of their success, right? And they also need to be doing the same sort of things and going through the same sort of conversations that our students of color are having in order to understand the world that they are going out in. Because if they only see people who look like themselves in those senior positions, and they just think that is the world that will always be. And we're working towards a world that's not always that. That is more diverse, and that representation is more diverse. But at UMGC, we are very similar. I've been here almost 11 years, and when I came aboard, similar to Georgina, I was a director, and then the position was elevated to vice president and chief diversity officer. I believe I was the only African-American on cabinet for a while, but now we have a very diverse cabinet, or more diverse cabinet, should I say. And just as of 2 weeks ago, we now have a Black president. And so, the diversity is reflected more in obviously the president's office, the executive committee, and on cabinet. But there is a point, as similar to a lot of institutions, where that diversity at that, if you could call it mid-senior level, right, where it kind of stops, right? It just falls off. And so, there's this level where people are having a hard time getting from what is perceived to be a more junior position. Maybe you get to be a director, but then what, right? And then there's a stall that can occur. And so what we need to do is make sure that we are creating an environment where that stall doesn't happen, and that there's a real evident path to seniority, because one, you've seen someone else do it, and it doesn't seem like an abnormality. It doesn't seem like you have to luck into it, but there is a real path. And so what we work with our HR team on is, how are we building that pipeline of talent? How are you supporting that talent? So, and many of you have probably been in institutions where, in order to move up, you have to leave and then come back, right? Have you ever seen that journey that someone has to go on? That's the only way to get more money, or the only way to get a new job title. And so what we're saying, we want people to stay. We want that retention piece, because you don't want to lose that intellectual knowledge, that knowledge about the historical knowledge about who we are. And so we really need to be developing that talent so they stay and advance and create positions for them, even if they're not there yet, and so we need to be making sure that we are doing everything we can to, so people can see themselves, because everyone can't go to cabinet, right? There's only so many seats at a particular table, but there are opportunities for people to move into more senior level positions.
Yes, that's very true. And it's also kind of reflecting the barriers that may not let, certain groups advance to higher level positions. So now kind of following up from those questions. So how can faculty learn more and affect change? And to some extent, that was discussed a little bit when we were talking about, microaggressions. But can you elaborate a little bit more? What can faculty do to educate themselves and then provide some change? And so let's start with Dr. Dosh in this case.
Sure. I think it was Leah who said this earlier. It could have been Blair, but I think it was Leah who talked about the importance of educating yourself and of not leaning on your Black and Brown colleagues to provide that education specifically. Because, as the comment was in the chat, these are populations that are already being heavily taxed. And that simply adds to it. I know because I get a lot of